Hi. Last part of chapter 9 and on to chapter 10. The most important thought correlation of all is a switch in the perspective of our thinking. Perspective substitution and correction. Perspective substitution is a broadening of our overall perspective. It moves our viewpoint from the critic's narrow negative focus to the more balanced and accurate focus of the observing ego, the mindful self. Perspective substitution helps us to dethrone the critic from the life-negating point of view. It resembles the firing of a bad manager or inept coach. One with a distorted view who dwells so much on what is wrong that he cannot see anything that is right. As I stated in chapter 1, perspective substitution can be enhanced with the spiritual practice of gratitude. In this vein, gratitude is a type of mindfulness that looks for empirical proof that life is essentially good, even though it is also quite difficult at times. Perspective substitution and gratitude. Gratitude is a delicate subject to write about because many survivors have been abused by shaming advice to just be grateful for what you have. Consequently, many survivors totally reject the concept of gratitude and throw the baby out with the scorn-sodden bathwater. Once again, this is quite understandable when you legitimately had little to be grateful for in your childhood. Moreover, the concept of gratitude is damagingly used by some psychologists to support the psychological defense of denial. They tout gratitude as a fast track that can bypass traumatic pain. This is worse than absurd when applied to ptsd survivors. It is in fact shamefully abusive to survivors because profound extended trauma cannot be resolved until it is fully understood and worked through. Gratitude is nevertheless a wonderful natural experience that can recurrently enhance the quality of your life. You can cultivate a perspective that is open to noticing what there is to be grateful about, as long as you do not do it with the intention of creating a permanent feeling of gratitude. Over time, an attitude of gratitude can gradually increase authentic gratefulness. This can be best illustrated with the example of love. While it is of course healthy to adopt a cognitive attitude of love toward our friends and chosen family, it is impossible to feel loving all the time. If I expect that of myself, I give my inner critic endless fodder to attack me for not feeling loving enough. Similarly, if I expect myself to feel grateful all the time, I keep the critic's prodigious program of self-disappointment hale and hearty. Nonetheless, aligning with attitudes like love and gratitude is generally therapeutic. When I am temporarily stuck in a flashback feeling alienated from life, remember what I'm usually grateful for in life can sometimes pull me out of a polarized negative thinking that helps keep the flashback alive. Invoking gratitude is particularly difficult and often impossible at first because flashbacks typically strand us in an emotional overwhelm that cancels out our ability to feel anything good about life. Reminding ourselves of what is worthwhile in our lives does not seem to help much in the early phases of using this tool. However, with enough practice of positive noticing, we can sometimes relax out of a flashback by invoking our memories of gratitude. When I experience this at the end of an especially long flashback, positive noticing sometimes arises spontaneously and brings with it sweet tears of gratitude. There are also typically tears of relief and tears of an achieved sense of belonging. These tears typically arise unbidden, seemingly out of the blue. Typically they are positively triggered by experiences of beauty or connection, such as when flowers authentically strike me as beautiful once again, and when my appreciation of music returns and deeply moves my soul, or when I suddenly feel how much I love my wife, my son, my friend, or my client. After a painful lapse in being able to emotionally enjoy these experiences, this return brings these gratitude-laden tears, which are really momentous occasions, can vacillate between crying and laughing. as I resurface into authentically being grateful to be alive. Once again, my experience is that the more I practice the thought substitution of focusing on what I am grateful for, the sooner genuine gratitude returns to me on the occasion that I lose touch with it. A powerful way to practice perspective correction is as follows. After you go to bed at night, list at least 10 positive happenings of the day. More often than not, these will not be peak experiences, but rather basic and simple pleasures and appreciations. They may be as simple as catchy tunes, an engaging color, a sweet scent, an enjoyable food serving of the day, a new flower in a local garden, a satisfying TV show, a neighbor's hello, a feeling of fitness climbing the stairs, soothing words from a favorite author, or a pleasant encounter with a pet. Decades of this practice have helped me immeasurably to upgrade the sour perspective I inherited from my parents. Alignment with this function of the healthy observing ego provides us with more balanced and accurate perceptions of life and other people. The neuroplasticity of the brain. I am repeatedly heartened to read the accumulative evidence from neuroscience research that proves the neuroplasticity of the brain. Neuroplasticity means that the brain can grow and change throughout our life. Old self-destructive neural pathways can be diminished, and new healthier ones can replace them. General Theory of Love by Thomas Lewis inspiringly explicates this fact. This fact helps me to remember that the critic can indeed literally be shrunk via long-term, frequent, and dedicated use of the thought-stopping, thought substitution, and thought correction practices. As recovery progresses, you notice the critic sooner before its attack becomes multidimensional. This then allows you to take more immediate self-protective action. Moreover, ptsd flashbacks can be utilized as evidence of, and in later stages of recovery, proof of your childhood traumatization. Flashbacks point irrefutably to the fact that your parents' abandonment forced you to habituate to hypervigilance and negative noticing. Chapter 10, Shrinking the Outer Critic. The outer critic, the enemy of relationship. In CPTSD, the critic can have two aspects, inner critic and outer critic. The inner critic is the part of your mind that views you as flawed and unworthy. The outer critic is the part that views everyone else as flawed and unworthy. When the outer critic is running your mind, people appear to be too awful and too dangerous to trust. When she was stuck in an outer critic attack, one of my clients would often rant like this. Everybody sucks. People are so selfish and scary. They either fuck you over or they let you down. She even eventually named this an I'm moving to another planet flashback. The outer critic is the counterpart of the self-esteem destroying inner critic. It uses the same programs of perfectionism and endangerment against others that your inner critic uses against yourself. Via its all or none programming. The outer critic rejects others because they are never perfect and cannot be guaranteed to be safe. As with the inner critic, the outer critic attacks are usually internal and silent, unless you are a fight type, as we will see below. When we regress into the outer critic, we obsess about the unworthiness, imperfection, and treacherousness of others. Unconsciously, we do this to avoid emotional investment in our relationships. The outer critic develops in reaction to parents who were too dangerous to trust. The outer critic helped us to be hyper-aware of the subtlest signal that our parents were deteriorating into their most dangerous behaviors. Over time, the outer critic grew to believe that anyone and everyone would inevitably turn out to be as untrustworthy as our parents. I'm not totally sure that's wrong still. Kind of seems relevant. Now, in situations where we no longer need it, the outer critic alienates us from others. It attacks others and scares them away, or it builds fortresses of isolation whose walls our laundry lists of their exaggerated shortcomings. In an awful irony, the critic attempts to protect us from abandonment by scaring us further into it. That's a really tricky line, though. If we were ever to discover the comfort of soothing connection with others, the critic's dictatorship of the mind must be broken. The outer critic's arsenal of intimacy-spoiling dynamics must be consciously identified and gradually deactivated. 4F types and their outer critic-inner critic ratios. Depending on your 4F type, you may gravitate to either the inner or the outer critic. Different 4F types generally have different ratios of outer and inner critic dynamics, and some polarize extremely to one or the other. Freeze and fight types are often polarized to the outer critic. Fawn types tend to be dominated by the inner critic. Flight types can have the most variance in inner and outer critic ratio. Your subtype can also have a big influence on this. The freeze type can judgmentally denounce the entire outside world to justify her all or none belief that people are dangerous. The flight type can use his own perfectionist striving to excel so that the outer critic can judge everyone else as inferior. The fawn type uses inner critic self-hate to self-censor and avoid the fear of being authentic and vulnerable in a relationship. The fight type, in a paradoxical twist, controls others through the outer critic to prevent them from abandoning him while at the same time using prickliness to not let them get too close. Fight types can also leave at the first sign that the other cannot be controlled. One fight type, who I worked with briefly told me with great upset about a recent betrayal. His new partner insisted on replacing the empty toilet paper roll so that the new roll unwound from the bottom instead of the top. He asked her once to do it in this way and felt so betrayed when she did not comply that he broke up with her. I could not help feeling that she was fortunate that she got away. Unfortunately, this client was not able to take in that the lion's share of his upset was a flashback. He had flashback to his rigidly controlling mother frightening him into believing that the toilet paper must unwind from the top. She had punished him into believing that it was a universal truth. Perfectionism in the hands of the outer critic can be paranoidally picayune. Finally, it is not unuseful for survivors who have significantly shrunk their dominant critic mode to experience a reciprocal increase in the virulence of its opposite counterpart. This came as a disappointing shock to me at a time when I was congratulating myself that my inner critic was a mere shadow of its former self. Soon thereafter, I noticed that I was plagued by a new judgmentalness that seemed out of character. Curiosity and a growing mindfulness about this development led me to a lot of the insights that I share in this chapter. With enough mindfulness, this shift in critic mode can then become an opportunity to further shrink the overall combined agency of the outer and inner critic. Passive aggressiveness in the outer critic. Ooh. Children are initially wired to respond angrily to parental abuse or neglect. Outside of the fight types, most traumatized children learn early that protesting parental unfairness is an unpardonable offense. They are generally forced to repress their protests and complaints. This then renders their anger silent and subliminal. This anger, however, does not disappear. It percolates as an accumulating sea of resentment that can fuel the outer critic's obsession for finding fault and seeing danger in everyone. Viewing all relationships through the lens of parental abandonment, the outer critic never lets down its guard. It continuously transfers unexpressed childhood anger onto others and silently scapegoats them by blowing current disappointments out of proportion. Citing insignificant transgressions as justification, the survivor flashes back into outer critic mode and silently fumes and grumbles in a long judgmental rumination. To bastardize Elizabeth Barrett Browning, how do I find thee lacking? Let me count the ways. When silently blaming the wrong person becomes habitual, it manifests as passive aggressiveness. Common examples of passive aggression are distancing yourself in hurt withdrawal or pushing others away with backhanded compliments. Other examples include poor listening, hurtful teasing disguised as jokes, and the withholding of positive feedback and appreciation. Chronic lateness and poor follow-through on commitments can also be unconscious. Passive-aggressive ways of expressing anger to others. Refusing to give voice to the critic's point of view. The Outer Critic is the author of this intimacy-spoiling program, Being Honest to a Fault. In the guise of honesty, the Outer Critic can negatively notice only what is imperfect in another. Under the spell of perfectionism, the Outer Critic can tear the other apart by laundry listing his normal weaknesses and foibles. When challenged about this, many fight types will respond, "I was just trying to be honest." The inner critic has its own version of excessive honesty, which I sometimes call beating you to the punch. Afraid of being criticized, as in childhood, the inner critic can launch the survivor into a confession of her every defect in hopes of short-circuiting anyone else from bringing them up. Sometimes hearing the criticism from yourself feels less hurtful than hearing it from someone else. After all, it's old news to you and your critic. I subscribe to authenticity as one of my highest values, but it does not include sharing my outer critic's views of you or exposing my inner critic's unfair judgments of me. As stated earlier, the toxic critic is not an authentic part of us. We were not born with it. We were indoctrinated with it by parents who viewed us in an extremely negative and jaundiced way. Because of this, we need to protect our intimates from its distorted and destructive judgments. As importantly, we need to protect ourselves from alienating people by presenting ourselves as if we are so defective that we do not deserve to be loved. Outer critic dominating flashbacks. Holly, an elderly client in a flight type, was suffering minor age-related memory loss. She started her session chuckling, "I was reading your article on the Outer Critic again last night. I didn't really get it when I read it 3 years ago, but I get it now, and I think it's because my memory deterioration has a silver lining. So you know how I'm always blaming my husband whenever anything goes wrong at home? Well, I'm starting to get that it's an all-or-nothing outer critic process that I get stuck in. I've been blaming him for misplacing and not putting things away for decades, but I've started to notice that it's me who often misplaces things. I was cooking a meal last night and looking for food scissors that I used up to cut up leafy vegetables. It wasn't on the magnet wall strip where I insist that we keep it, and I immediately started feeling very angry with him, and more angry as I searched in various drawers to no avail. The longer I searched, the more exasperated I got, and sure enough, I found myself laundry listing all his faults. My resentment rapidly escalated and peaked with me deciding that I really was going to leave him this time. As I continued to amass evidence that he was a terrible loser and that this was a wise decision, I went back to the stove and found the scissors where I'd left them 5 minutes ago. I could see the scrape of spinach still on them from when I'd cut it over the pot. What a mortifying epiphany I had, especially since a similar thing had happened with the toothpaste the night before. I forgot I had put it on the medicine cabinet in one of my organizational upgrades, and I was convinced Frank had moved from its proper place. I started reading him the riot act so intensely that he pretended he was going to get something out of the car, and then when I went to the medicine cabinet for some aspirin, there it was, where I had placed it myself. Oh my God, that outer critic did an instant about-face into becoming the inner critic. And then, when it had contemptuously lambasted me to tears, I suddenly had another epiphany about how I would let any mistake on his part launch me into a 2-volume history of his past mistakes. I'd get so stuck in the negative noticing that I couldn't call to mind a single good thing about this good enough husband that I have had for 35 years. Holly and I spent a great deal of time fleshing this out. She could see that the outer critic typically triggered her into a very old feeling and belief that people are so unreliable that they always let you down. They just can't be trusted. Side note, therapists like this are really rare. This is very much not how most sessions are. This person is simultaneously a great person and therefore a good therapist. I wish everybody could have a therapist like this. We then moved into exploring her childhood, looking for clues as to where this belief that people were so untrustworthy began. She closed her eyes, took a few deep breaths, and then she opened them. Tears trickled down her face. It was Father, Daddy, that incredibly selfish, alcoholic a-hole. Please pardon my French. No matter where I hide my babysitting money, he'd always find it and come home drunk later, crying about how sorry he was and how he'd never do it again. He'd even let me go off on him. Oh my God, just like poor Frank. Just sit there and take it. Only poor Frank, more tears. He's never done anything like that to me. He's pretty reliable in most ways, except for not being as organized as me. Outer critic modeling in the media. Outer critic entrenchment is also difficult to dislodge because its parlance is normalized and worse, celebrated in our society. Skewering people seems to be standard practice in most TV comedies. Moreover, many influential, seemingly healthy adults model a communication style that is rife with judgmentalness, sarcasm, negativity, fear-mongering, and scapegoating. Giving control of our social interactions to the outer critic prohibits the cultivation of the vulnerable communication that makes intimacy possible. We must renounce unconscious outer critic strategies such as 1. I will use anger criticism to make you afraid of me so I can be safe from you. 2. Why should I bother with people when everyone is so selfish and corrupt? All in on thinking. 3. I will perfectionistically micromanage you to prevent you from betraying or abandoning me. 4. I will rant and rave or leave at the first sign of feeling lonely because if you really love me, I would never feel lonely. The critic, subliminal B-grade movie producer. The outer critic typically arises most powerfully during emotional flashbacks. At such times, it transmutes unconscious abandonment pain into an overwhelming negative perception of people and of life in general. It obsessively fantasizes consciously and unconsciously about how people have or could hurt us. Over the years, these fantasies typically expand from scary snapshots into film clips and even movies. Without realizing it, we can amass a video collection of real and imagined betrayals that destroyed our capacity to be nurtured by human contact. Don't trust anyone. Proud to be a loner. You can only depend on yourself. Lovers always leave you. Kids will break your heart. Only fools let on what they really think. Give them an inch and they'll take a mile. Are titles of video themes survivors may develop in their quest for interpersonal safety. These defensive and often subliminal daydreams are analogs of the critic-spawned nightmares that are also shore up the safety work of frightening us into isolation. Over time, with enough recovery, intrusive anti-intimacy reveries become clues that we are actually in a flashback and that we need to invoke our flashback management skills. I think I'm going to have some people stick around before I believe any of this. Or get to genuine gratitude. We'll see. The dynamics of the outer critic are often obscured by minimalization and denial. Its obsession and daymares often occur just below the level of our awareness. They become subliminal via their repetitiveness, like the sound of waves at the beach like the sounds of traffic in your city, like the sound of the critic repetitively calling you or someone else a jerk, a loser, a dumb shit. Watching the news is a trigger. Sometimes the outer critic's penchant for raising false alarms ensnares us with an insatiable hunger for listening to the news. When we do not resist this junk food feeding of our psyches with a news service that exalts so thoroughly in the negative, we can be left floundering in a dreadful hypervigilance. The critic can then work overtime to amass irrefutable proof that the world is unforgivably dangerous. Isolation and minimal or superficial relating is therefore our only recourse. At such times, any inclination to call a friend triggers images of rejection and humiliation before the phone can even be picked up. When the flashbacks are particularly intense, impulses to venture out may immediately trigger fantasies of being verbally harassed or even mugged on the street. In worst-case scenarios, outer critics' drasticizing deteriorates into paranoia. At its worst, paranoia deteriorates into fantasies and delusions of persecution. See, this is the problem. This is where rape culture is actually real, and I'm not paranoid, and often people are trying to fuck me over, or drug me, or trick me. Those are all real. That is very common. I was sitting on a park bench struggling to concentrate on the book I was reading. I had read the same short paragraph 4 times and barely registered a word of it. At the same time, I was becoming more and more aware of a group of people who had sat down behind me. I started feeling ashamed because they were having a great time while I sat there painfully self-conscious and despondent. Suddenly, I realized they were talking disparagingly about me. I was too scared to turn around. Their comments became steadily more insulting. Their loud laughter became increasingly mocking. In my mind's eye, I could see them all staring and pointing at me. Look at that sorry-ass loser. He's pretending he's not even listening. Finally, in desperation, I turned around and croaked out a weak, "What's going on?" I was shocked and even more mortified at the same time. They were not even looking at me. They were so immersed in their joyful banter that they had not even noticed I turned around and spoke. It became immediately obvious to me that it was a terrified figment of my imagination. I slunk away in shame and had to wait decades to understand how my CPTSD and outer critic had manufactured this terrible paranoia. Intimacy and the outer critic. Going hard today. As stated earlier, CPTSD typically induces an attachment disorder that comes from the absence of a sympathetic caregiver in childhood. When the developing child lacks a supportive parental refuge, she never learns that other people can soothe loneliness and emotional pain. She never learns that real intimacy grows out of sharing all of her experience. To the degree that our caretaker attack or abandon us for showing vulnerability, to that degree do we latter avoid the authentic self-expression that is fundamental to intimacy. The outer critic forms to remind us that everyone else is surely as dangerous as our original caretakers. Subliminal memories of being scorned for seeking our parents' support then short-circuits our inclination to share our troubles and ask for help. Even worse, retaliation fantasies can plague us for hours and days on the occasion when we do show our vulnerabilities. I once experienced this after being very honest and vulnerable in a job interview with a committee of 8. Over the next 3 insomnia-plagued nights, my outer critic ran non-stop films featuring my interviewer's contempt about everything I had said and disgust about all I had left out. Even after the subsequently and enthusiastically hired me, the outer critic plagued me with imposter syndrome. Fantasies of eventually being exposed as incompetent in the new job. The no-win situation. While scaring us out of trusting others, the outer critic also pushes us to over-control them to make them safer. Over-controlling behaviors include shaming, excessive criticism, monologuing, and overall bossiness. An extreme example of the latter is the no-win situation, which is also known as the double bind. It is described in the vernacular as damned if you do and damned if you don't. Only the most severe fight types do this consciously. These types are found on the end of the narcissistic continuum where narcissism turns into sociopathy. Sterling was a fight-type client of mine who is strongly narcissistic but not sociopathic. He wanted me to prove that I was meticulously attending to his pauseless monologue by giving him an empathetic at about the rate once a paragraph. He would usually cue me to do this by ending a sentence with, you know? Over time I could usually tell when he was in a flashback because he would be bothered by the frequency or quality of my He was alternately frustrated if I used too many or too few In the first instance, he fumed, haven't you ever heard of a rhetorical question? In the alternate instance, his frustration flared out at my lack of sympathy because I was not responding with enough. There is an inner critic version of the no-win situation. Howard came into the session with a 102 temperature and a raging case of the flu. He told me I was lying in bed, fluctuating between the sweats and the chills, and the critic was kicking my ass. You lazy, flaky piece of shit. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. Get off your sorry ass and get to your appointment. Howard then told me that he fought this for about 15 minutes, but the critic finally won, and he came. As he sat in my waiting room, the critic started in again. You're such an idiot. How could you be so stupid to go out feeling like this? You masochistic loser. You're just trying to kill yourself. Why do you even bother trying to get better? Scaring others away. To avoid the vulnerability of being close, the outer critic can also broadcast from the various inner critic endangerment programs. Catastrophizing out loud can be very triggering to others and can be an unconscious way of making them afraid of us. One of my basketball playing acquaintances is addicted to listening to a local doom and gloom news station. He was managed to alienate everyone in our gym by his nonstop proselytizing about the catastrophic demise of our times. One of the players joked that he will not pass him the ball anymore because he thinks the guy believes that it is impossible for it to go through the hoop. Survivors who unnecessarily frighten others by excessively broadcasting about all the possible things that could go wrong rarely endear themselves to others. Moreover, they force others to avoid and abandon them when their negative noticing reaches a critical mass and becomes noise pollution. Vacillating between outer and inner critic. Many CPTSD survivors flound in caustic judgmentalness, shuffling back and forth between pathologizing others, the toxic blame of the outer critic, and pathologizing themselves, the toxic shame of the inner critic. They get stuck in endless loops of detailing the rational inadequacies of others and of themselves. My parents' twisted version of this boiled down to, as fucked up as we are, we're still better than you. Karen Horney described this trauma two-step as all or none lurching between the polarities of the grandiose self and the despised self. When we become lost in this process, we miss out on our crucial emotional need to experience a sense of belonging. We live in permanent estrangement, oscillating between the extremes of too good for others or too unlikable to be included. This is the excruciating social perfectionism of the Janus-faced critic. Others are too flawed to love, and we are too defective to be lovable. Is it true, though? Might be true. If it's not, prove it. A verbal diagram of a typical cryptic looping scenario looks like this. The outer critic's judgmentalness is activated by the need to escape the in-danger feeling that is triggered by socializing. Even the thought of relating can set off our disapproval programs so that we feel justified in isolating. Extended withdrawal, however, reawakens our relational hunger of our impulse to connect. This simultaneously reverses the critic from outer to inner mode. The critic then laundry lists our inadequacies, convincing us that we are too odious to others to socialize. This then generates self-pitying persecution fantasies, which eventually re-invites the outer critic to build a case about how awful people are. And ad infinitum, ad nauseum. This loop then keeps us safe in the hiding of silent disengagement. When it emanates from the inner critic's direction, the vacillating critic can look like this. The survivor's negative self-noticing drives her to strive to be perfect. She works so hard and incessantly at it that she begins to resent others who do not. That's hard. Once the resentment accumulates enough, a minor faux pas in another triggers her to shift into extreme outer critic disappointment and frustration. She then silently perseverates and laundry lists people for all their faults and betrayals. How long she remains polarized to the outer critic usually depends on her 4F type. But sooner or later she starts to feel guilty about this, and suddenly the inner critic is back online, judging her harshly for being so judgmental. The cataloging of her own defects then resumes in earnest. A case example of the vacillating critic. My wife and I have been living together for more than a decade. We have come a long way in negotiating what seems to both of us, most of the time, a fair and flexible approach to handling the innumerable tasks involved in running a household with a young child. But sometimes, when I'm experiencing an extended flashback, I start over-noticing imperfections in the general household order. Where the critic first points the finger varies. If I'm triggered into tired survival mode, the inner critic can launch into berating me for my substandard contribution. If, on the other hand, I am triggered into flight mode and have been speed cleaning, my outer critic can start keeping score. In the latter mode, my outer critic can perseverate about how little my wife is doing compared to me. The comparisons are typically in the areas where I have recently been over-contributing. But my fawn side is pretty strong, and before too long I can start noticing all the avenues where I do not contribute as much as she. And suddenly I'm a selfish slacker of the family. As the flashback continues, I may then flip into berating myself for the picky and ungenerous. In an especially strong flashback, the outer critic will come back sooner or later and start assigning more weight and importance to my contributions, and then belittle her for being slack, thoughtless, self-involved, etc. In our early relationship, I could loop this loop for quite some time, losing hours, even days, to feeling disaffected from my wife and from myself. My peace of mind would deteriorate into an inner battleground of feeling abandoned by her while simultaneously judging myself for abandoning her. In the worst flashbacks, the process did not stay internal and would have conflicts about this issue. These days, conflict rarely occurs over chores, because what I have learned about the outer critic internal looping about this has also decreased immeasurably. Mindfulness about my outer and inner critic process allows me to identify them sooner and rescue myself and my relationship from them much more quickly.